Hello and welcome to another installment of the Car Nerd Talks, the automotive channel where I rant about usually classic cars. However, today we're staying firmly in redneck, all-American Chevrolet Dodge pickup territory, or as they call them in Australia, a ute.
Talking in the ute. Got heaps of fucking space in there.
So today I'm going to be talking about the original first generation 1981 Dodge Ram, and although I absolutely loved my 1987 Chevrolet pickup truck, I definitely want to get myself a Ram, probably not a 1981, maybe a 2010, 2012 one in the near future, especially because we've got some exciting stuff coming up, including a new channel as well as a restoration of a potential VW Beetle, but we'll talk about that later on because today we're going to be talking about the Dodge Ram from 1981, the first gen, how it came about, what it looks like, the engines, the usual stuff for the Car Nerd Talks. But before I do, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it because it helps put wine in the press, and that's very important for me when it comes to making content. The first ever Ram was introduced in 1981, however this was actually called the Ram D100 or D150 or D250 or D350, which I'll get into in a minute. However, the reason it was called D was because the Dodge DW trucks went all the way back to the 1960s, and the first generation Ram was essentially just an updated and upgraded Dodge D series or DW series, depending on something else, which I'll get into in a moment. So essentially this truck was basically the same as the 1960 truck or the 1971 truck or the trucks before it. So this was technically the fourth generation of the DW Dodge series trucks. However, it became known as the Ram because they reintroduced the Ram ornament and then they named it the Ram. So this was the Dodge D100 Ram, for example, or the Dodge Ram D150. And the reason for that Ram ornament is because they used this on some of their cars and trucks back in the 1930s all the way up to 1954 when they stopped using it and started just putting the Dodge logo on the front. Now the Ram choice was a really good idea for Dodge, as it turns out, because the Ram name is just a fantastic name for a truck, and so much so that Ram now has been spun off by FCA as its own separate brand. But we'll get into that as we talk about the Ram 1994 truck next week. So you've probably seen a few of these trucks around, and maybe you're wondering what the D, the W, the Ram and the Power Ram stands for. So going back to the 1960s model, the D or the Ram in the newest version stood essentially for rear wheel drive. And then you had the W or Power Ram, which stood for four wheel drive. This goes right back to the likes of the Power Wagon as well, which if you haven't seen one of these, check out something like Car Masters or Rust Valley Restorers. You'll see a lot of these Power Wagons. They're absolutely fantastic trucks, and they're just indestructible. Then we move on to the numbers in these. So at the time of the original Dodge Ram, or the third and second generation of the DW trucks, they had 150, 250 or 350. So you probably saw something like Dodge Ram D150. Well, the 150 actually stands for the same thing that the Ford trucks did, which is 150 is half ton, 250 is 3/4 ton, and 350 is a full ton truck. So Dodge at the time was no different, whereas now they have their 1500, 2500 and so on. So they've changed this to differentiate themselves from the F-150, so you couldn't have a D150 now, or it would just look like copycat. And this is because nowadays, and ever since the late 70s or early 80s, I believe it is, the Ford F-150 was the best-selling truck of all time, and still is, in America, of course. Best-selling truck in like Britain is the Transit or whatever, which is just way cooler. No, I'm kidding. Another interesting thing about this initial 1981 Dodge Ram is the chassis basically remained unchanged since the 1960 model, along with the body. And I'll go into that in the looks in a minute, but it's really incredible that between 1960 and 1994, when they introduced the all-new Ram, this truck essentially stayed the same. And that's pretty cool and tells you a lot about the feats of engineering involved in these trucks. As I mentioned before, the 150, 350, 250, etc. was kept on these trucks. However, if you see one and you want to correct me, be like, but Jason, there's a 150 and a 100. What the hell is a 100 then? The 100 was actually a replacement name. So in 1984, they changed the name of the base model trim from Miser, and that's, if you're Irish, Miser sounds like. Anyway, so the 100 was actually just a replacement name for the absolute base level. So that is essentially a 150, but with Feckle trim. In terms of the looks, this truck was essentially just a move on from the previous third generation D150. It essentially just square bodied it. So in the 80s, essentially most trucks were gone to the square body. So even for example, the Chevrolet CK range, which is the predecessor to the Silverado, in the 1980s, like my one, the 87 one, which you can watch here, that truck had a square body, and this was becoming kind of a trend at the time. Ford, with their F-150, was moving over to kind of square-bodied styling, and this was just kind of a thing in the 80s, which is really weird at a time that was just after an oil crisis. You think they'd want something more aerodynamic, but anyway, these kind of box body shapes were what people were going for. And that didn't just extend to the shape, it also extended to the lights at the front. For example, this car, or this truck should I say, previously had round headlights. Now these were square headlights, and in fact the square headlights on this truck kind of looked like someone had just taken your grandfather's CRT TV, or my CRT TV from when I was young, and just placed it in each of the headlight sections. So it did look kind of weird. They had also done the same thing as Ford and Chevrolet were doing at the time, which is the back tail lights will wrap around, so it came around to the side. I'm not sure if there was some sort of rule for this, but this is kind of a trend that's carried on since the 80s till now on a lot of cars. You don't really see just backlights anymore, and I'm assuming it's so you can see them from an angle. But anyway, I digress. Moving on to the interior was completely upgraded for this new Ram model, and a new bench seat was put into place, along with new dials at the front, so the whole dashboard was replaced as well, with a kind of tri-setup on the dash. In the middle was your speedometer, and then you had your tachometer and whatnot to the left and right. One interesting feature of this truck's interior is that if you didn't go for the higher trim level, if you got the normal 100 and the lower package without getting the fuel package, your oil temperature and oil pressure gauges were replaced with just simply the indicator lights. So you didn't even get that kind of level of trim. In terms of engine choices, if you were to have bought one of these new in 1981, you would have only been given 3 choices of engine. One of these was a slant 6, which was a 225 cubic inch, which means 3.69 litres to the rest of us from outside of America. Slant 6, and this produced 170, no sorry, this produced way less, 170 brake horsepower. God, no, 95 brake horsepower, but it did pump out 170 pound-feet of torque. So it wasn't too bad for pulling around, and would have been the best on gas consumption. It's essentially the same engine, except in my 87 Chevrolet, it was a 4.8 litre, so it's essentially the same kind of setup, but with very, very low power outage. Then if you went into the V8s, you could have a 318 cubic inch, or to the rest of us, a 5.2 litre of displacement V8, and this one pumped out 140 brake horsepower and 240 pound-feet of torque. And finally, for the big spenders amongst us, you could go and get yourself a 360 cubic inch or 5.9 litres of displacement V8, and this produced 175, should I say, brake horsepower with 260 cubic inches. So that's the one you wanted to go for if you were showing off to friends, or if potentially you had the club cab, and the club cab was still available in 1981, which was kicked out in 1985 and then not brought back until 1991. My final word on this truck is this truck introduced the world back to the Ram name and really brings us back to where things were going. And the Ram went from this styling to become the most luxurious truck you can buy if you're buying any of these pickup trucks, and it really just shows how well that brand and moniker works. I think when I look at the Ram now, it's still the one that I want, and unfortunately this truck didn't really bring in that styling the 1994 truck, which I'll talk about next week, did, but this was definitely a step in the right direction by bringing that Ram moniker back. So that is today's episode. Thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to tune in tomorrow to watch the GM EV1 episode, or if you just need your fill of cars, check back through the catalogue. We've just done a history of Jaguar yesterday, along with a couple of other Jaguars before that. Thank you so much again for watching. Hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, and join me in tomorrow's episode. Goodbye.